The South China Sea is perhaps the most disputed and hostile body of water on our planet. For years, tensions have ebbed and flowed between the United States and China regarding this critical expanse of ocean. But these days, things have turned fatal. Within recent months, Chinese fighter aircraft have even fired flares in the direction of a Philippine plane. U.S. naval warships are tailing Filipino ships at risk. And for the first time, American bombers have made joint patrols with Philippine fighter planes over land that China claims as its own. Every encounter is more hostile, every response more brazen. A single blunder, a single misjudgment, could set off a war that would shake the whole world. Are we on the brink of war in the Pacific more than ever before? Stay with us now as we analyze the latest military confrontation between China and the United States and why things could blow up at any time. The most recent military confrontation between China and the United States in the Pacific did not arise suddenly. It is the culmination of years of increasing competition, power games, and strategic maneuvering. All in all, each side is driving the other toward the edge. To understand why the skies are currently filled with flares and the seas filled with warships, we must reflect on the road that brought us here. At the center of the conflict is the South China Sea, a huge body of water that China claims nearly in its entirety as its own, invoking the so-called nine-dash line. The claim intrudes deep into the waters that other countries, like the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei, also rely on. It's not simply about national pride or map borders. These oceans contain trillions of dollars in trade lanes, huge oil and gas reserves, and fertile fishery resources on which millions depend. But China didn't just stop at the drawing of lines. It has constructed artificial islands in the past decade, developing submerged reefs into heavily defended military outposts. There are now runways, missile systems, and radar stations where there used to be open sea. These outposts provide China with the ability to monitor and dominate key shipping lanes and project military power across the region. Of course, this frightened the United States, which has a long-standing policy of protecting freedom of navigation on the high seas. The U.S. Navy started making routine patrols, dispatching warships and aircraft through the regions China claims as its own to defy what the U.S. views as illegitimate expansion. Chinese forces would reply each time, sometimes with threats, other times by following American ships or flying near American planes. The message was the same from both sides: we won't give in. But what has made the situation particularly perilous is China's growing pressure on weaker nations such as the Philippines. Beijing has employed Coast Guard ships and maritime militia vessels to intimidate Filipino fishermen and cut off supply missions to military outposts. It's a game of bullying, which involves squeezing the weaker players into submission while challenging the U.S. to intervene. And now, the U.S. is entering the fray more directly than ever. Under a new defense agreement, American troops are closely collaborating with the Philippine Armed Forces, conducting joint exercises and patrols deep in the heart of contested waters. No longer is it merely a matter of threats and warnings. American bombers are taking to the skies with Filipino fighter planes, and American warships are standing watch between China and its neighbors. The balance of power is tipping, and both sides are aware of it. That's what makes this moment so perilous. Every confrontation is no longer merely a demonstration of force, it's a test of will, and the closer these forces move, the greater the danger that one spark, a collision, a misfire, a misinterpreted command, might ignite something much more devastating. Let's look at some recent developments that perfectly capture the growing tensions in the region. There had been tensions in the South China Sea for years, but August 2024 saw a dangerous escalation, one that brought the world's attention directly back to the area. It was not a standoff between distant warships at sea or a cold look across disputed waters. This was air aggression, quick, lethal, and just seconds from disaster. A Philippine military cargo plane was on a routine resupply flight. It was passing over disputed waters off the Spratly Islands, a chain China claims as its own, but which also hosts several Philippine outposts. The flights had always been tense, with Chinese radio operators often issuing warnings. You are entering Chinese airspace. Leave immediately. But this time, the response was much more dangerous. Two Chinese fighter planes, J-11, armed and on standby, unexpectedly intercepted the Philippine aircraft. They flew close to the Philippine plane in a threatening manner, so close that the Philippine pilots could read the markings on their fuselages. This was already a breach of international etiquette. But what followed shocked military analysts worldwide. The Chinese planes released flares directly in front of the Philippine aircraft. For those unaware, flares are not just flashing lights in the sky. They are decoys used to confuse heat-seeking missiles, blazing with an intensity of thousands of degrees. To drop them in front of another aircraft is an act of sheer intimidation, on the verge of an attack. If either of those flares had struck the Philippine plane or ignited fuel vapors in the air, the result could have been catastrophic. The aircraft might have exploded in flames, and all of its crew members could have been lost. The Philippines denounced the act as reckless and provocative, a clear violation of international aviation norms. The Chinese government, however, brushed aside the allegations, praising their pilots as safe and accusing the Philippines of instigating the incident by entering Chinese airspace. But in private, military leaders throughout the region were disturbed. This was no mistake or wayward pilot. It was a calculated message from Beijing. We own these skies. We are willing to take risks. Stay out. The United States took notice. American intelligence verified the reports, and top defense leaders warned that China's air force was growing increasingly aggressive, not only toward the Philippines, but against all aircraft in the area. Some American commanders, in private, feared it was only a matter of time before a flare, or a missile, found its target. The South China Sea skies were no longer contested. They were fast becoming a war waiting to happen. And the world had just seen what the opening salvos of a war over the Pacific would look like.
Few weeks after the air confrontation between Chinese warplanes and flares, tensions escalated again, this time on the seas. In September 2024, an event occurred that escalated the confrontation between China and its competitors to treacherous new heights. But this time, the United States was not sitting on the sidelines. It was in the middle of it. The catalyst was a routine but essential deployment by the Philippine Navy to resupply its forces stationed on the BRP Sierra Madre, a rusting warship deliberately beached on 2nd Thomas Shoal, an outpost the Philippines uses to protect its maritime claims. For years, such resupply missions had been fraught with risk. Chinese Coast Guard ships and maritime militia would regularly harass, block, and sometimes ram Philippine vessels trying to bring food, water, and medicine to their stranded soldiers. But this time, the stakes were higher. The Philippines had requested assistance, and the United States responded. As the tiny flotilla of Philippine vessels drew near the disputed shoal, an American Navy destroyer was patrolling in the vicinity, closer than it had ever been. Its presence was not a coincidence. The message was unambiguous. The US is present. The US is watching. The Chinese also didn't hold back, and their reaction was rapid and threatening. Two massive Chinese Coast Guard vessels, accompanied by several militia craft, positioned themselves between the Philippine supply ships. Radio threats were broadcast over loudhailers. "This is Chinese territory. Get out now." However, the Philippine captain maintained his course. The American destroyer moved in, close enough to let the Chinese know that they were not alone. For a few hair-raising hours, the standoff unfolded on the open sea. The ships circled each other, their crews bracing for the worst. One miscalculation, a collision, an unexpected turn, could have ignited an international crisis. In the end, the Philippine vessels survived, just barely perhaps, but they survived. Aid was sent to the stranded troops, but the message to China was equally unmistakable. This isn't finished. Next time, you won't be so fortunate. US military commanders subsequently characterized the confrontation as one of the most dangerous on record. They conceded that American warships would soon be required to physically accompany Philippine ships on these missions, a move that would virtually ensure future clashes with China. The episode highlighted a dangerous change. The United States is no longer defending freedom of navigation at a distance. It is now standing shoulder to shoulder with its friends, right in Beijing's face. And as both sides dig in, the world is starting to understand that this is no longer a fight about rocks and reefs. This is a struggle over power, and the first battle could be just around the corner.
If August's aerial aggression and September's naval standoff made it clear that tensions in the Pacific were escalating, then October 2024 shattered any illusions of a return to calm. This time, the the skies over the contested Scarborough Shoal, a strategic flashpoint in the South China Sea, became the stage for an unprecedented display of force. For the first time ever, U.S. Air Force bombers flew a joint patrol alongside Philippine fighter jets over the disputed waters. This was not a routine flight. This was a deliberate and coordinated show of military strength designed to send a message to China and the world. The Philippines is not alone. The U.S. is prepared to defend its allies, side by side. 2 U.S. B-1B Lancer bombers, capable of carrying nuclear and conventional weapons, flew low and steady over the shoal, an area that China seized from the Philippines in 2012 and has controlled ever since. Alongside them, 3 Philippine FA-50 fighter jets cut through the air, the clearest sign yet that the military alliance between Manila and Washington was entering a new phase. Chinese radar systems lit up immediately, surveillance aircraft scrambled from nearby bases, and reports later surfaced that Chinese anti-aircraft missile batteries were placed on high alert. Beijing branded the patrols as provocative and a threat to regional peace, accusing the U.S. of militarizing the dispute. But for the Philippines, this was long overdue. After years of being bullied and outmaneuvered, Manila was finally flying alongside the world's most powerful air force, directly over waters that China claims as its own. To Filipino officials, this was not just a patrol, it was a promise. When the time comes, America will fight with us. Military experts watching the situation saw something else, a dangerous evolution in the conflict. For the first time, the risk was not just at sea or through risky aerial encounters. The stakes were now higher and deadlier. When bombers enter the equation, the language is no longer about warnings, it's about war. Privately, U.S. defense officials acknowledged the risks. The presence of nuclear-capable bombers in contested airspace was an unmistakable escalation. One wrong move, a misinterpreted maneuver, a radar lock-on, or an accidental missile launch could trigger a military response within minutes. And this time, it wouldn't be just a supply boat being blocked or flares lighting up the sky. It could be missiles. It could be fighters downed. It could be warplanes falling into the sea. The October patrol made one thing crystal clear. The US-China power struggle is no longer theoretical. It is here. It is real. And now, bombers are circling the battleground. The current face-off among China, America, and their friends is much more than fighter aircraft, warships, or contentious reefs. Below every hazardous exchange of fire in the air or waters is an even bigger contest to dominate power, control, and the world, and nothing greater is at risk. At the center of the conflict is the South China Sea, perhaps the most economically significant waterway in the world. More than $3.5 trillion of commerce flows through the waters annually, 1/3 of the world's shipping. These shipping lanes are the lifeblood of economies throughout Asia and around the world. If this waterway is shut down or comes under China's total control, the economic shockwaves would devastate world markets. But Chinese ambitions extend beyond commerce. Control of the South China Sea is part of Beijing's larger ambition to supplant the US as the preeminent military and political force in the Indo-Pacific. For China, these contested waters represent security, resources, and influence. They regard US military presence as an impediment to their ascendance, an effort to contain China's expansion and avert its regional supremacy. That's why Beijing militarized artificial islands, used its coast guard as a second navy, and bullied smaller countries like the Philippines into submission. Each reef secured, each fishing vessel harassed, reaffirms China's hold on the region. But for America, retreating is not a possibility. Losing control of the Pacific would destroy America's reputation as a world superpower. Allies such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia are paying close attention. If Washington lets the Philippines down today, who will believe the US will protect Taiwan tomorrow? And Taiwan is the specter looming over the whole thing. Most military experts think the tensions in the South China Sea are a warm-up, a proving ground for China's long-term objective, reclaiming Taiwan through force. If that occurs, the US would be drawn into a direct conflict with China almost inevitably. There's more. Natural resources. The South China Sea contains an estimated 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Whoever owns these waters would own these energy resources, further enhancing China's economic and military ascent, or depriving its competitors of them. And perhaps the greatest danger is not deliberate aggression, but an accident. A crash between warships, a panic-fired missile, a fighter pilot making the wrong decision. The error margins are hair-thin, and a small flame could set off a war that neither side really wants, but neither side can afford to lose. This is why the world is watching. This is why the Pacific Standoff is important to everyone, because what comes next could remake the global order for decades to come. The risk of war. How does the Trump administration look at the entire situation? With tensions in the South China Sea at their most perilous level in decades, the world is now posing a chilling question. How close are we to war? The reality is, closer than most would care to admit. Military leaders, diplomats, and analysts all agree. The situation is now on a knife's edge. Every month, confrontations between Chinese forces and US allied nations are growing more aggressive, more frequent, and more reckless. The boundary between deterrence and provocation is dissolving, and the margin for error is disappearing. In Washington, Donald Trump's return to the White House in 2025 has radically changed the tone. Famous for his America First foreign policy, Trump's government is urging an even harder line against China. Top aides close to Trump have publicly labeled Beijing as America's biggest threat, with some contending that the US needs to prepare for a possible war in the Pacific sooner rather than later. Defense budgets are already soaring, with the new government putting its faith in peace through strength, a philosophy that holds military superiority as the means of avoiding war. But this is risky. A greater military presence may deter an adversary or drive them into action before they lose the initiative. But there is one more factor hanging over every Beijing and Washington decision: the specter of Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 rocked the world, but also exposed fault lines in the West's resolve. While the US and its allies gave weapons, money, and sanctions, they drew the line at direct military intervention. To Chinese leaders, it was a lesson. The West can bluff and bluster, but when confronted with a resolute foe prepared to use force, it dithers. Xi Jinping was paying attention. Beijing observed Putin push the limits and get away with it. China watched the US struggle to balance support for Ukraine with fears of escalation. And some leaders in China's leadership believe that if they act quickly, either in the South China Sea or against Taiwan, the US may end up blinking again. Now, add to that perception Trump's mercurial comeback. While Trump blusters about China, his earlier statements questioning US alliances in Asia and NATO have also raised eyebrows. Some Chinese strategists think Trump might end up pulling the US inward, exposing allies such as the Philippines or Taiwan to danger. This reality is that both the US and China think they are fighting for their rightful role as the leading power in the Pacific. Both perceive the other's moves as aggressive. Both are gearing up for the worst. And within this climate of suspicion, miscalculation is the actual enemy. Because the initial shot, either by accident or design, might trigger a war neither can easily contain. The world is watching in suspense. Because if war begins in the Pacific, it won't remain there. It will spread across continents, economies, and generations. And the instant that spark ignites, it will already be too late.
So where is all of this headed? Are we indeed on the verge of war, or is there still a retreat from the precipice? At this moment, the Pacific is trapped in a vicious cycle. Every Chinese provocation is met with a US display of force. Every American patrol inflames Beijing's sense of encirclement. And with every near miss, jets, warships, bombers, the spring coils just a little tighter. Diplomacy remains an option, but just barely. Negotiations between US and Chinese military leaders have repeatedly stalled, and trust is deteriorating rapidly. Even regional actors like Australia, Japan, and the Philippines, eager to prevent war, are arming themselves and bracing for the worst. Some believe China is playing a long game, gradually pushing limits, avoiding direct conflict while consolidating control over disputed seas. Others are concerned about a reduced timetable, particularly if Xi Jinping sees the window to seize superiority narrowing, especially as Taiwan fortifies its defenses and the American military pivots increasingly into the Asia-Pacific. And threatening everything is uncertainty from Trump's government. Will his tough posture intimidate China into withdrawal? Or will it provoke Beijing into preemption before America's military buildup overwhelms them? The thing is, a single error could render all such questions moot. A crash, a miss, a pilot's mistake, and everything goes awry. This is why the world waits with bated breath. The South China Sea is no longer a local quarrel. It's the fault line of an international power struggle, and if it shatters, the aftershocks will be felt across every nation, every marketplace, and every horizon. The Pacific confrontation is not about who rules the oceans. It's about who owns the future. This concludes today's video. We hope it has been both entertaining and informative. Stay connected with us for the latest updates, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.